This is part two of Project Hope, the Art of Persuasion. Okay, now last time I talked about currency and how to develop your argument for who you're intending it to. If you're talking to children, trying to convince them to wash their hands and stuff like that, you would use different language and different tone than if you were talking to adults or you were talking to teens. Now, the second thing that you have to do, like, so tone and the way you interact with the person, the currency and everything, keeping the currency in mind is one aspect of developing your art of persuasion, like developing your arguments. I briefly talked about the arguments themselves. Now, when you're actually talking to a group of people and you are trying to persuade them, you have to use facts. You have to think out a reasonable argument, and that involves proofs. It involves, again, it involves their currency. Like, for example, in the article that I linked to in uh, the last presentation, the last workshop, I linked to my speech in Denmark, the one that where I was presenting the Muslim point of view with regards to freedom of speech versus cultural sensitivity. Now, in that situation, imagine how I felt. I felt very like a lot of trepidation, which is a big word about kind of being scared and hesitant because I'm obviously from a marginalized community. And like I said in the other workshop, when all cultures can learn from each other. And even though you're from a marginalized community, there are reasons why you have chosen the path you've chosen. Often Western societies, they believe in assimilation, that we should all be like them. And there's a lot of good things they can teach us, but there's other things that we can hold on to that we value within our own cultures too, which is what I was talking about in terms of the give and take, things that they could learn from us as well. Now, about persuasion, the persuasion, if you have the intention of bringing the whole of society forward, if your intention is not just to show someone up, but rather to to argue in a way that brings everyone up, then what you're doing is actually a service to everybody. It's a service to all of mankind. I know that sounds kind of pompous, but basically, you're trying to increase the dialogue between cultures, to increase the understanding so that we can all work together. And that's actually kind of a noble thing to do. So, persuasion can be used to serve noble causes. Now, sometimes I watch those Marvel movies with the superheroes and everything like that. And what they're doing is they're doing like some grand gesture that is going to save the world. Life is not usually like that. In fact, to save the world, life is actually more of a constant struggle. It's a constant trying to persuade people to do what's best for everybody and not just what might be selfishly best for themselves. Okay. For example, H.G. Wells, when he wrote his science fiction fantasies, like, for example, the one about, I can't remember the name of it, The Time Machine. The Time Machine basically is an argument, it's a proof using the currency of who he was talking to, which was like Victorian society, to show them that their situation of privilege was actually detrimental to them because it eats at their moral foundation. Okay, so it wasn't good for them, and it wasn't good for the people who they were oppressing. Now, so this is a kind of an argument that actually can uplift all of society. And when you do this effectively, you can actually bring about huge social change. Like right now, I'm doing a lot of research into a time period when they were arguing against the idea of slavery. Now, um, what fascinates me is social dynamics. Actually, I find social dynamics really fascinating. And it fascinates me that people as a society can actually talk themselves into all kinds of really questionable things and sometimes even horrible things. They can talk themselves into mass murder. They can talk themselves into racism and a, a, a horrible attitude towards a whole group of people that people from outside that culture, they don't understand the whole cultural paradigm. They don't understand the way these people are thinking that they would be able to do that. But when you're actually in the midst of that, how do you see through all this persuasion going around you? So don't think of persuasion as something that's not important. It's actually very important because ultimately, like I said at the very beginning of this whole two-part series, is that we're each individuals. Each one of us are an individual. We have one life to live. And during that lifetime, there's only a certain amount of damage or good that one person can do. But if you can persuade people with your vision, if you can persuade them, then you can actually multiply the good that you can do. You can actually bring people on board and multiply that good, or unfortunately, you can also multiply the harm. It depends on the person. Now, a lot of the time, we look at some of the disasters, like for example, the Holocaust. When that happened, we think, well, how can God allow something like that? And I believe in God. But the thing is that the mistake we make is that we think that this is something that God allowed. We don't realize that this is actually something that people allowed. That I mean, Hitler was one person on his own. How much harm could he have done? What he had to do was he had to convince a whole bunch of people to go along with him on his nefarious schemes. He couldn't have done it by himself. He had Goebbels and all these other SS people and everything like that. And the fact that he was able to convince a whole group of people to go along with his evil is actually the biggest danger about persuasion. So just in the same way that people were able to persuade other people that, hey, we should not enslave these people and these black people, we should not keep them subservient, even though in many ways they still are, but at least they're not enslaved like they were back then. The same way that people were able, like Henry Clay and a bunch of other people, worked to get rid of this idea that slavery was okay and it was just like an economic institution, is the same way persuasion can also be used to bring people down. It's all about like this whole freedom of choice. It's all about an individual going along with it. And if you can bring out about enough persuasion that you get enough people on board, you can either do something really good or you can do something really bad. Now we're living in times. Now, remember I talked about tone, voice, the way you talk to people. We're living in a time where people have been using that, and they've been using the authority that their position in society has given them to get a lot of people to go along with things that we know inherently are wrong. Now, they've been doing this. It's been widespread, especially like I'm talking about the current president of the United States, who is has a lot of problems, and what he's done because of his own problems and his own feelings of insecurity and everything like that, he's persuaded by using the lowest common denominator. He's basically used racism and people's fear of having little and their fear of losing their wealth to get them to do things they should not be doing. So to fight that, how do you fight that? Especially when you're someone like me, you're a marginalized person. You know that people look at, I know that people look at me, they see the hijab, they see that, oh, I'm Muslim, they see the brown skin, and they think, well, what does she have to tell me? You know what I mean? But what you have to do is you have to, again, use their currency. You use their currency and you talk about the things that we agree about. Like, for example, that everyone has a right to happiness. Everyone has a right to self fulfillment. Everybody agrees with that, that we all have a right to earn our living and try to do the best we can. I mean that's part of the Constitution of the United States. So building your argument on top of that, you can actually go further and make your argument that, hey, doing the things that you're allowing is not good for you in the long run. It's not just that it's not good for me. It's not good for all of us. So that's how you use persuasion. So you have to use proofs, you have to use arguments, you have to use facts. Now some people are averse to facts. They have closed their minds off, and there's not much you can do with them. But that's actually not the majority of the population. The majority of the population are actually trying to be pretty good people. Most people do believe in what's right. So that's an advantage. I mean, it can look almost hopeless in the situation that, oh, evil is just running rampant. But at the same time, there are enough people that see what's wrong. You're not the only one. There's enough people that see what's wrong. And what you have to do is persuade them to all come together because there is strength in numbers. Okay, so you in doing that, you have to anticipate what their objections will be. Because, okay, what are their objections? Maybe one of their objections is that, yeah, but if I don't do what he says, Trump, I'm talking about, or everything, if I don't do that, I might lose my job. Now, you have to deal with that. And you have to use argument and rationale, thinking, to think about the best way to address that concern, because that's a legitimate concern. Okay. And you have to anticipate. And what I mean by anticipate means to predict what the other person is going to say back. Like if you look at that speech I did in Denmark, I basically anticipated all of the arguments that the audience would have against what I was saying. I anticipated them and I expressed them. I said, yeah, I hear you. I know that immigrants might feel like unwanted house guests. Okay. And I anticipated their arguments. And then what you got to do, you anticipate their arguments. But anticipation means you have to empathize. Empathy means that you have to understand and feel sorry. Well, not exactly feel sorry, but get where they're coming from. Okay. And if you can have empathy and get where someone else is coming from, even though you disagree with them, then that gives you the tool to address their concerns, to validate them. They say, yeah, yeah, I get it. I get how you feel. And then you argue with them, and you argue using proofs, using facts, and you basically, what I like to say is you whap them over the head with the facts until they say, oh, okay, 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 I get it. You're right. Okay. Once you can do that, you've won the argument because you've anticipated, you've used their currency, and you've anticipated and you've brought them to the good that you're trying to include. And when you have a good argument, there's not much people can do. It doesn't mean they're going to actually follow through on it. Because again, who is saying this? It's someone who's marginalized, someone who's brown. I'm not I'm not some celebrity, okay, that's saying this stuff. So a lot of the people will look at it and think, I don't have to listen to her, even if she's right. You know, I don't have to listen to her. But some people will listen, and it's a slow progression. You start small, you start just as one person, but eventually, if you can make your arguments, if you can persuade people, and you can show them that eventually what you're saying has soundproof, and that means that you're constantly testing what you're saying for being accurate, because you can't go around um, uh, trying to spread some falsehoods. That's not going to get you anywhere, because eventually people poke through it and they say, no, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. So you have to make sure what you're trying to sell, what you're trying to persuade people with, is the truth. If it's the truth, no matter what they say, they cannot really argue against it, because truth is truth, and truth will win over falsehood in the end. I know sometimes it might look hopeless. It might look like, oh, as a society, we're just falling apart. And yes, it's like we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But those steps forward are important. And actually, if you look at humanity as a whole, we actually have come a long way. And it's been our better nature, the goodness in the vast majority of people that has overcome the darkness. Okay, darkness will last maybe for a while, but eventually goodness will win out. I almost think it's a promise. Okay, so instead of thinking of those big grand gestures of saving the world, think in terms instead of steps and perseverance and steps that we may need to go forward and the way we need to persuade one another to fulfill our better natures. Okay, if we appeal to the good in each other, we can eventually overcome the evil. And that's the reason why persuasion is so important. It's to rise all of us up. It's not just the individual, it's to rise all of us up because we are powerful in numbers and there are more good people than there are bad people. And although sometimes it looks like the bad people are winning, it's always temporary. I mean, look at Hitler. He was one of the worst people in all of humanity, and it all collapsed on him. Okay, so have hope. Have hope. Use your mind. Use your rationale. Use your voice. Use your perseverance towards lifting the better nature in people, giving people hope, and and hopefully that will make us all a better society.